Hi everyone. So since Blizzard keeps nerfing those normal dungeon farming spots that people have discovered all the time to try to push them to do some other content, people have been asking me, what is the new best content to do? And well, in my case, I have just been running nightmare dungeons ever since the game launched basically. So this is how I had leveled up, almost 3 characters now, and I had a blast doing nightmare dungeons. I think they're very effective, and especially with some of the top tier dungeons being nerfed now, they are probably more effective than that anyway. So I sat down on stream the other day to make a nightmare dungeon tier list to rank them by 3 different categories. Number 1, probably the most important one for most people right now, is the character XP. So how to level up fast, which dungeons are the fastest to go. Then the Glyph XP, so if you want to just boost your Glyph and you don't really want to level up your character anymore, you're level 100 already or close to it, you might don't care so much about the actual monster XP, but about completing each dungeon faster, because all of the dungeons give the same amount of Glyph XP at the end, depending on the tier of course. And lastly, the pushing viability of each dungeon. So pushing might be a bit of a foreign concept for a lot of new viewers in particular, but if you come from Diablo 3 then you will be familiar with this. So this is simply going as high as you can. So for my ranking I did this like tier 80 plus. So this is like really tough content that only really good builds will be able to handle. And then how easily can you defeat a dungeon all the way up to tier 100, going from like, a very high starting point. Because things change a little bit when you're not just farming and blasting through the dungeon, but on those higher tiers, monsters have incredibly high HP values. They basically 1 or 2 shot most builds. So you have to play very differently to try to like slowly progress through the dungeon very carefully. And some of those dungeons have very dangerous monster types, or they have these intermission events where you have to click the levers and you're like, blocked by those walls and you're like locked into the arena. So these kind of moments make it very difficult to complete a tier 100 dungeon, for example. So I try to rank them by their dangerousness, so to say, on that ranking. And what I did to make this ranking is I used my rapid fire rogue here and I literally ran through all of the dungeons like 1 or 2 more times just to kind of get a refresher, because some of them I was not really like too familiar with because I just left them out for the most part. But I have been farming nightmare dungeons, as I said, non-stop basically since launch. So I've probably done like every single dungeon like a few dozen times at least. So I'm very familiar with what's going on in each of them. So here's my document. I have this linked in the description if you want to go check it out. This is open to everyone. You can go share it if you want. And I have made this overview here for all of the dungeons. So you have to know that there are 30 dungeons, 6 in each major region. So there's always like kind of like a rotation of dungeons. So they might be different in season 1 and in season 2, etc. So at least this is the intention of the developers. But this makes it kind of easy to group them together based on their region and their appearance. So these are the icons of each of the dungeons. And then we have them ranked here. So I have the time. I just benchmarked like a few runs or one or 2 runs or so. And just try to get a bit of a feeling for how long they take. This was usually done with full clears on a relatively fast build. So as I mentioned, I was playing Rapid Fire Rogue, which is pretty decent. And I was discounting events like Cursed Chests or Cursed Shrines or so. So I reduced the time there a little bit. Of course, the mileage may vary, especially slower builds will take a lot longer to clear some of those dungeons. Or sometimes they can be cleared a lot faster if you don't full clear them. Sometimes there are ways to shortcut them. So this goes mostly into the Glyph leveling here. This completion time is mostly relevant for this Glyph leveling ranking here, because there you care about nothing else but completion time. Some dungeons also get a bit of a bonus or malus, depending on how far you have to travel to them. So for example, Dark Ravine is like the biggest outlier here. This has like the longest travel time of like, I don't know, 2 minutes or something to even get to the dungeon. Which is not a bad dungeon to run if you are there and if you have multiple sigils. For example, you stack them up or you're in a group and it's quite easy to find multiple copies of the same sigil. But for like, a single run, running a Dark Ravine, even though it's not too terribly long, it gets like a really bad ranking because of the long travel time. So sometimes this has been adjusted there. Likewise for the XP ranking, so most of the time you don't really have the luxury to farm multiple of the same dungeon in a row. Sometimes you can stack up like 2 or 3 sigils or so, but that's usually about it as a solo player. So I also included the travel time a little bit in those rankings. And even though you have relatively significant travel time of like a minute or a bit longer sometimes even in some dungeons, they can still be very, very good for XP, because either you spend a lot of time inside the dungeon, and in general, because nightmare dungeons give a lot more XP than regular dungeons. You can be underleveled, so you can choose to be underleveled compared to the monsters, as opposed to regular dungeons where the monsters are always your level or even below you if you're above level 95, because they cap out at 95. If you are underleveled towards the monsters by 3 levels, you get a 25% bonus XP, and you also gain slightly more bonus XP for fighting high level monsters. And finally, the high tier push. So as I mentioned, this is mostly ranked by the difficulty of a dungeon, so how hard will it be to get through it on a very high tier. So this is usually based around the monster types and these intermission events. And also sometimes you have certain objectives or certain bosses that might be a bit easier or harder than others. I have all the objectives listed here so that you kind of know at a glance like what you have to do inside the dungeon, which can be kind of important, especially for this high tier push. And also I added some notes. For example, I wrote down all of the special elite affixes. So sometimes you have to defeat, certain special elites, and they're always fixed. And it's kind of good to understand beforehand what they actually do. And I have all of the monster types listed here together with the objectives, because sometimes the monsters actually change throughout the dungeon. So you go from part 1 to part 2, and then like another monster type appears or something like that. But in general, it was actually a quite interesting experience making this tier list, I gotta say. So looking at those 3 ratings here, some dungeons actually are like very good in one of them and then really bad in the others or so. And interestingly, it seems like most of the dungeons have like their own strength, so to say. So there's not really that many that have like overall great. So if you look at this, for example, Champion's Demise, I figured it's like a really good one for XP farming. Even though they nerfed it lately, it's still pretty nice because first of all, you spend a lot of time in there. So if you get like a nice sigil that you can run with easy affixes and stuff, you don't have any downtime with like, going to town and selling and traveling somewhere. So it's really nice to just like stay in there and blast. And it's obviously extremely terrible for Glyph XP because this takes 6.5 minutes to complete solo for me. So this is like the longest dungeon by far. And some of the faster dungeons here, Molewood, for example, 2.5 minutes. So this is extremely short compared to something like that. So these are the 2 extremes here when it comes to Glyph leveling, for example. So you have an S for Molewood and an F here, and then everything else is kind of like in between. The dungeons that I find worth running the most for XP, so this is how I leveled up to 100 and then my other character to 90, was with Gurang Canals. Onyx Hold is actually relatively good. Then we have Iron Burrows. That's what a lot of people are farming, especially in groups right now, with the normal dungeon variant at least. Earthen Wound. And we have down here Elderwood. So these are my top picks for the dungeons. If you ever get those sigils, you want to run them unless they have really bad affixes. There are a few more that are also really good that I like. So Sunken Ruins is pretty packed. Then we have Wraithwind Wilds, Renegade's Retreat, Abandoned Mineworks, Witchwater, Serpent's Lair, Molewood, Cultist Refuge, and Champion's Demise up here. So there's actually a pretty large selection of dungeons that I run for just leveling up my character. And yeah, early on at least, Glyph XP doesn't really matter too much. So when you're just like level 70, 80, or even 90, you don't care too much about this second column here. This is mostly like for later if you want to like boost the Glyph, to the maximum really quickly. And those kind of top tier dungeons already cover like almost half of the entire selection of nightmare dungeons. So you have a lot of dungeons that you can or want to run, and you can still like leave out some of them. For example, Onyx Hold is like one of the more difficult dungeons. It is very good for XP, but it is also filled with pretty dangerous monsters, so you might have some trouble there, and you can just leave it out. And you are still fine with like, more than 10 dungeons to run or so. And then there are still those B tier dungeons that are also just fine, whenever you have like a decent sigil or nothing of the others. Then you can also run something like Cordragan, Lost Archives. We have Morgan's Works here, even though that was nerfed, it's still okay. Crusader's Cathedral. And we have a Whispering Pines down here. So these are also dungeons that I just go to sometimes when I'm out of sigils for the other stuff. And then I mostly leave out all of the stuff that is like C or D tier or something like that. So Pharaoh's Den, Demon's Wake, Prison, Conclave, Shadow Plunge. So these are dungeons that I don't really like to do here. Zenith. So I think they're just kind of slow, they're kind of like long, dragged out. I checked the XP values, it didn't really seem too great. Or they have this insanely long travel time here, like Dark Ravine, for example. That just makes them not really that great, even if the dungeon itself is relatively decent. The top glyph farm dungeons are definitely Elderwood, so even though the time here is relatively long, you can shortcut it a lot. So this was a full clear time, but you can kind of like take shortcuts and make this like, you know, at least a minute faster or something like that. And Moorwood. So those two like wood dungeons here, they are really good. Lost Archives is also pretty fast actually. You can also shortcut a lot there by avoiding to backtrack. And yeah, these are like the top 3 picks here if you just want to boost your glyphs. And then there's a bunch of other like kind of decent ones, like there's Raven Wilds here, for example, that is pretty fast. You have Prison of Chaldean, that's actually pretty fast. Crusaders Cathedral, Witchwater, Morgan's Works, Serpent's Lair, Cultist Refuge, and the Gulran Slums here. So these are the dungeons I would focus on if you want to get your glyphs up. And occasionally they also overlap with being just decent for XP, for example, Moorwood here. So there's always just like a nice dungeon to run for farming. And lastly, when it comes to high tier pushing, my top picks are Champion's Demise, Dark Ravine, then we have Blind Burrows, and Renegade's Retreat. So these are the S tier push dungeons. These dungeons usually don't have like super crazy tough monster types or like elites to deal with. There are some exceptions. So for example, Renegade's Retreat is overall a very easy run, but it has like this one big dude, like this elite that you have to kill, and he is Frozen, Chilling, Suppressor, and Vampiric. So this is like the combo of death. But as long as I can get past this one guy, you kind of have an easy time in these dungeons. And all of these don't have an event, which is very important. So these events can be like the absolute killer of a run, unless you can somehow get through them easily, or you have like a shrine ready or something like that, like a protection or a conduit. But for the most part, yeah, pushing will be done in those dungeons that don't have these events. So if you don't know what I mean with intermission events, these are those rooms here where you walk in and then you have this, you know, slay the guardian, slay all enemies, survive for 30 seconds, etc. And because there's little space to kite around, I think this will be a major problem for most pushing scenarios at least. Some other dungeons that I think would also work pretty well on a high tier push would be Morgan's Works, Serpent's Lair, Elderwood, and Pharaoh's Den. So there's another 4 to select here. But outside of those, it starts getting a bit tough, I imagine. Obviously, this will also depend a lot on the kind of build you're running, like how tanky you are, how well you can kite, like also how good are you at outplaying monsters. So my expectation is that at least on the tier 100 push, basically most builds will essentially get one shot or close to it, unless you have like some really tanky setup. So this means you have to very carefully proceed through those dungeons. And in some cases, you have like a lot of ranged monsters there. And, you know, for example, Pharaoh's Den has like Quill Fiends. Those Quill Fiends can be quite deadly, so you gotta be very careful of those. But outside of that, like everything else is kind of easy, so that's why it gets a decent rating here. And to give some examples of some really terrible push dungeons, we have a lot in F here that I would basically never step foot into. So Ancient's Lament, for example, it has like Fallen and Red Ghosts, and then it has an event as well. So this is like, you know, basically as bad as it gets. And then you have here Gulran Canals, where you have like a really tight space, like little room to maneuver. It's really packed. There's wasps everywhere. And then you also have an event there. Or for example, Onyx Hold, which has Red Ghosts. And Red Ghosts are like the deadliest monster type in the entire game. So there's like almost no way to outplay those. And then you also have to deal with Suppressor elites. And you have an event. So this is like basically as bad as it gets. I have some notes listed down here or also up here when you hover over this thing. This might not be available if there's too many people viewing this, so I have to copy paste it. But in general, yeah, I just made this tier list based on just my experience with the game so far. Obviously, I have not played every single build. Of course, I have not pushed every single dungeon to a super high tier yet. And I also talk a lot from like a hardcore perspective because I play only hardcore for now. So in general, yeah, your mileage may vary. But I think that at least this overview gives a bit of an idea of which dungeons are good for what purpose. So it seems like most of them actually do have a purpose. If you look at this, so some of them are just like kind of universally bad. For example, Ancient's Lament is something that I don't really like. But you have stuff like Dark Ravine that, yeah, it's kind of bad for farming, but can be very good for pushing. Or the other way around. So sometimes you have stuff like, for example, Moorwood, very good for farming, kind of mediocre for pushing. So there are those exceptions here. Some dungeons are overall really good. For example, Blind Burrows is just like solid all the way. Especially in groups, it probably gets an S everywhere because you can split farm it. And it's like super crazy. Then you have the AAA dungeon here, Serpent's Lair. That's a pretty funny one. And Witchwater as well, actually. So we have those dungeons as well that are just like solid all around in my opinion. But I also heard from a lot of people, for example, that they have trouble dealing with those snakes. So again, this is also kind of like, you know, under the consideration of how well you can play around certain enemy types, how well your build can handle them, and so on. But yeah, as you can see, almost every dungeon actually has like at least a B or an A somewhere. So Whispering Pines has like BCF, for example, and then we have ABC, AAD. So yeah, they all have like some kind of like viability besides some exceptions. So Demon's Wake, for example, kind of bad across the board. Same with Shift Up Ruins. And Crusader's Cathedral is literally bad, even though I kind of like running it. Actually, it's like one of my favorite dungeons just from, yeah, like feeling perspective. But yeah, Conclave, I feel, is like overall really bad. Shadow Plunge is overall kind of bad in my opinion. Then we have Zenith up here, we have Black Asylum, so these have really bad ratings. These are the dungeons I would generally stay away from at all times for now. And this concludes my tier list here. Let me know what you think. Maybe have some completely different findings, or maybe have some more data. I would be very curious about anything like that. And just to like hear from people, like what are their experiences in certain dungeons with certain builds or something like that. Especially when it comes to the high tier push. Because this is kind of like the biggest, yeah, like question mark, I guess, in this whole thing. So depending on when you watch this video, I might have adjusted a few things. I might, you know, go back and rearrange it a little bit. But for the most part, I think this is a pretty solid list. Obviously, if people like this, then I'm probably going to continue doing something like that for future seasons, especially when it comes to Nightmare Dungeon pushing. I think it's going to be quite good to have an overview like this. And especially with leaderboards being introduced to the game at some point, I think that Nightmare Dungeons are going to be part of that. So it might be really good to kind of get in this pushing mood or something quite early. That's it for the video. Hope you liked it, and I'll see you guys next time.